Welcome back to the Environment Matters. We are continuing our conversation on biodiversity conservation and management in Guyana. And if you've just joined us, we have in the studio Ms. Stacy Lord, Senior Environmental Officer at the Environmental Protection Agency, Dr. Priya Maharaj, lecturer in the Department of Biology at the University of Guyana, and also the director for the Center of Study for Studies of Biological Diversity. And we also have Ms. Juliana Passad, Biodiversity Officer from the World Wildlife Fund, or WWF as it's commonly known. All right, so welcome back. And as we continue our discussion, before we went to the break, we started to focus some more on the role of biodiversity in terms of us connecting in our everyday life. And we just want to highlight some other areas in terms of biodiversity conservation and management in Guyana, the role of protected areas in that process. So who wants to, to start off that aspect of the discussion?
Well, protected areas in Guyana, they are used as a tool for biodiversity conservation. We currently have 5 protected areas throughout the country, and within these protected areas, they house representative biodiversity in Guyana. Some of them have biodiversity that are found nowhere else in the country. So, for instance, we have marine turtles nesting at the Shell Beach protected area, and within the other protected areas, those species are not found. So, in Guyana, our protected areas are designed also to facilitate sustainable resource use. Some protected areas are designed to completely lock out communities from using resources, but we have not taken that approach to our protected areas. So communities that are living either within or around protected areas are allowed to use resources in a sustainable manner for their traditional activities and traditional livelihoods. Um, Protected areas, what they do is to keep the environment safe, keep a safe space for biodiversity and for people. And usually, protected areas are large. Are large. They can either be on land or in the marine environment. We don't have a marine protected area in Guyana as yet, but they're usually large enough to facilitate good functioning of the environment. Um, Surrounding protected areas are what are known as buffer zones, and these zones are important for preventing impacts from flowing into protected areas. But I think the story is in terms of biodiversity protection, it goes a little bit beyond protected areas. So it's good for us to have protected areas, but at the same time, we need to keep the environment outside of protected areas well functioning, healthy, in order for um, biodiversity within protected areas
That's right.
to thrive. Um, so I think we have the Protected Areas Commission in Guyana, which has that focus on ensuring that protected areas are well managed, and we have a number of other organizations working with communities, working to protect lands outside of protected areas, working to ensure that activities that are happening within these areas outside of the protected areas are sustainable, are done in the best possible way using best practices.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. So the activities that are done outside of the protected areas, if I hear you correctly, those are crucial to the function, the effective, in order for the protected areas to even function effectively in conserving biodiversity. So again, we can't take for granted. Oh, we have protected areas, so we're covered. But in that process, there are things that we could do that could actually hinder the protected areas from fully performing their functions. And you mentioned sustainable use of biodiversity. So when we talk about sustainable use of biodiversity, what are we speaking about? Because there are persons out there who think, well, there are all these systems and policies in place. How are we supposed to develop? How are we supposed to get finances? How are we supposed to use resources? The environment, of course, as we know, and the resources that are provided are there for us to utilize, right? But as you mentioned, over exploitation and all these unwise usage that is actually causing some of the issues that we're experiencing. So we're promoting sustainable use of resources. What are some of the considerations in that regard?
Well, sustainable use, it simply refers to, in the case of biodiversity, sustainable use refers to using resources in such a way that you do not cause harm to the resource. That is, so maybe this is better illustrated by an example. So we have an area of forest. We would like to conduct forestry, some logging activities on this bit of forest because logging earns us income. So one way to do that is we clear all the trees in this area, right? That's called clear felling. Well, in terms of sustainable use, that's definitely not sustainable. Or we could practice selective logging, which is you're only cutting trees that are of a certain height, of a certain width, mature trees, and then at the same time you're not cutting all mature trees. So sustainable use, it's doing things in a way that ensures that the environment at the end of the day can still thrive, can still perform its functions, and can still survive well into the future.
Allow it to time to rejuvenate, so that others can benefit as well from the resources.
Yes, exactly. Allow future generations to be able to benefit from these resources. So we're not the only generations that should be benefiting from our biodiversity.
Excellent.
And simply put, you can imagine a rubber band. A rubber band is something, it has a function. Let's say the function of the rubber band is to hold a bunch of papers together. So it has a function. Your ecosystem has a function. That rubber band could be stretched, and then it will rebound to its normal, its original size, and it still is able to carry out its function. You can stretch a rubber band again, it will rebound, and it will be able to carry out its function. That rubber band, however, if it is stretched too much, it has a breaking point. That is how we need to think about our ecosystems. They have a breaking point. And at that point, they will not be able to rebound, or they will not be able to come back to what it is, what is their initial role or function. So there is a breaking point, and we need to ensure that we do research so we can figure out what is happening, how it's happening, what is that breaking point, and how it is that, as Juliana would have pointed out, we don't get to that point, but we use our resources in such a way that it's available for future generations.
Excellent. That's an excellent analogy.
To add to what Priya and Juliana would have said, the only way that we can do that is to ensure that we have proper management systems in place to allow for us to use the resources in such a way that we can rebound. So again, research is important. We need to be able to monitor our usage so that at the end of the day we can say, well, this is how far we can go, this is how much we can use, this is what we can get from it, and allow for others to be able to get to be able to make use of those resources. So a proper management system is important to sustainable use, and monitoring is important to sustainable use as well.
And in terms of management system and monitoring, we mentioned that this is a collaborative approach, of course, even though a specific agency may be the focal point, and we need to work with other partners. In that regard, the EPA has been working with a number of other agencies and institutions, such as UG, of course, and the World Wildlife Fund, Protected Areas Commission, Conservation International, AIRCROM, and so on. But with regards to World Wildlife Fund and project, what are some of those projects that you have been working on or you're currently implementing to contribute towards this whole process of biodiversity conservation and management?
Well, WWF has been working in Guyana for more than four decades, and this is the focus of our work: biodiversity conservation, sustainable development. Um, since that time, 40 years ago, our activities in Guyana have grown considerably. We're focused on three broad thematic areas. So, forestry, conservation of forests, that's one of our big thematic areas. Under this area, we are involved with a lot of partners in Guyana, government partners, academic partners, civil society partners, working towards protected area management, toward the conservation and protection of areas outside of protected spaces. We have been working particularly with communities in southern Guyana to implement a system for monitoring resources and well-being. So that's work with over 35 communities in southern Guyana. Coming back to the point that Priya and Stacy raised about being able to monitor our resources and to understand what's changing about these resources. And I think the point here is that, government agencies are not the only ones with roles in monitoring and understanding what's happening with resources, but civil society, communities, we all have a role. And so part of our work under our forestry theme is to empower communities to be able to monitor, to be able to track what's happening with their resources. We also have a program on freshwater protection. So that program at the moment is focused on reducing the use of mercury and to support a gradual phase out of mercury use in the artisanal and small scale gold mining sector. Mercury has been historically used in our ASGM, or small scale gold mining sector, and we know that mercury is a neurotoxin, very harmful to the environment, very harmful to humans. But of course, mining has been the bedrock of our economy for a long while. So our work on protecting freshwater, protecting freshwater habitats is now focused on reducing the use of mercury in the gold mining sector. And that impact would not only impact the environment, but it also impacts it would also have a positive impact on miners, in the sense that their health should be improved by not using mercury. Our program also extends to the marine environment, focusing on sustainable fisheries and better planning for the ocean space. The ocean is not as researched as some of our land spaces, and we know less than we do about our forest. And so, we're building that momentum, keeping that momentum going when it comes to working on marine issues.
Excellent.
We also focus on policy. We know that governance is so important to all of what we do, to have strong policies, robust legislation, and to have the involvement of civil society and all partners in the process.
Excellent. So I want to come straight over to Stacy. We're talking about, the importance of data collection and getting necessary information for informed decision making. You know, the EPA has a biodiversity research process, and there's a nexus with UG as well, CSBD. So could you tell us briefly, probably, who needs to apply for biodiversity research, and just briefly what that process entails and
Okay.
what's the relationship with UG?
All right. So anybody that intends to do research, biodiversity research, has to apply to the Environmental Protection Agency to get the necessary permissions to be able to conduct that research. The process is an online process where first you have to register as a researcher, and you also have to register your institution with the agency, and then you have to fill up research application. When we receive that application, you are also required to pay an application fee of $75. And if that application does not come into the agency 3 months prior to the start of your research activities, then you're required to pay an additional $40 late fee. When we receive that application, it is reviewed by the relevant agencies, and then it goes through a process of review, basically. And then you're advised as to whether your research activity will be permitted. If your activity is permitted, then you're required to pay a research permit fee. That fee is dependent on whether you're a student or an academic and the size of your team. Any person conducting filming activity that involves biodiversity, they are also required to apply to the agency for the necessary permissions. Once we grant you that permit, you're allowed to go conduct your research activity. No one should conduct any research activity unless they have the necessary permissions from the agency. Now, when you conduct your research activity and if you are required to collect specimen, that is where the Center for Biological, the CSBD comes in. And so after we grant you that permit and you conduct your studies, you collect your specimen, you then take it to the center, and so from there on, Priya will.
That's so Priya. So Priya, you can just briefly highlight what happens next, and probably just some of the other projects briefly that UG is involved in.
So when the researcher and their team comes to the Biodiversity Center, we ensure that you have collected what you said that you were going to collect as it relates to your permit, where you would have collected it, and the time frame. In addition to that, we do something called a verification process. And what that verification process basically entails is us checking what you would have collected to ensure that it abides by all the rules that the EPA would have laid out in their research permit. For this verification process, there is a fee attached, and this fee depends on whether you are doing academic research, whether you're doing commercial research, and the quantities of specimens that you bring in. Once we are satisfied that you have done what you are supposed to do in terms of adhering to the proposal that was submitted to the EPA for your research permit, we then advise the EPA on whether an export permit can be granted.
Okay.
The EPA will then issue an export permit. After that permit is received, the Biodiversity Center will then release the specimens, because you would have now gone through the process to ensure that we know what you're doing, where you have done it, and what you have collected as a result of that research.
All right. All right. So thank you very much. Your final thoughts as we wrap up. I could start with Juliana.
Well, as we're talking about biodiversity and its importance, I guess I think the main thing for all of us is that biodiversity is all around us. It's in our everyday lives. It gives us the food that we eat, the fresh air that we breathe, water that we drink, and it's not something that's far removed. It's not in the forest. It's not, in some other country. It's with us here, all around us, influencing what happens in our daily lives, influences our health, influences our mental health. So let's just build our appreciation for nature that is all around us.
Priya?
And as we think of biodiversity and we think of biodiversity research, let us not just think of the sciences. We need to think of the social and the economic impacts of biodiversity, the health impacts of biodiversity. Biodiversity is interconnected with all of these fields and these areas. And it is important not just for us to look at biodiversity, but the human interaction with biodiversity, simply because we have such a large role to play as it relates to biodiversity.
Excellent. Stacey?
Yeah, it's important that we all understand that we have a role to play. And I believe this conversation should jumpstart the entire conversation out there for those who have not been having that conversation. It's important for us to know, how we can contribute or why we need to contribute in terms of management and sustainable use and conservation of biodiversity. So going forward, I mean, there is a lot more that we can discuss, and I welcome the opportunity to come back and, for all of us to come back and share more. But, it's very important that we know that we all have a role to play as it relates to biodiversity, because at the end of the day, we cannot exist without it.
Excellent. And I do hope that this discussion will indeed jumpstart a new conversation in terms of biodiversity conservation management, and we start looking at our practices differently. Ladies, I want to thank you very much for joining us on this edition of the Environment Matters, and to you, the viewers, for tuning in to the program. We want to thank you for allowing us into your home, your homes, your offices, wherever you have been viewing the program from. And we do encourage you to view the bottom of your screen for the broadcast times, and tell your families and your friends, spread the word, because we're all in this together. The EPA, of course, is always willing and ready to be of service to you, and you can contact us via various social media pages as well as our website, or you can call us. Until next time, I leave you with the words of Gay McPherson, and he says, if you really think the environment is less important than the economy, try holding your breath while you count your money. Until next time, please have a good rest of your month.